12 merchant ships crawled into the harbour of Messina, Sicily. It was October 1347. The people on the docks expected a routine delivery of silk and spice. Instead, they found a ghost fleet. Most of the sailors were already dead, slumped over the rigging. The few still breathing were delirious, vomiting black blood, and covered from head to toe in hideous, oozing dark boils. The terrified locals immediately forced the ships back out to sea, but it was already too late. The killers had already left the boats. We've all heard the textbook version of the Black Death. Fleas on rats, terrible hygiene, Europe loses a third of its population, the end. But the actual reality of what happened between 1347 and 1351 is far more chaotic, terrifying, and profoundly weird than a simple medical mishap. It was a perfect, apocalyptic storm, driven by geopolitical trade, a sudden shift in global climate, and a fundamental misunderstanding of reality. To understand why it hit so hard, you have to look at Europe right before the disaster. For 3 centuries, everything had been going great. Population was booming, food was plentiful. Therefore, people kept expanding, clearing forests and building crowded, tightly packed wooden towns. But then, the weather turned. The medieval warm period abruptly ended, replaced by torrential rains and freezing temperatures. Crops failed year after year. By 1315, Europe was starving. Millions were malnourished, meaning an entire generation grew up with severely compromised immune systems. They were a population of walking tinderboxes, just waiting for a spark. That spark didn't start in Europe. It started thousands of miles away in the stepping grasslands of Central Asia. A tiny bacterium named Yersinia pestis lived quietly in the digestive tracts of fleas, which lived on wild rodents. Normally, this stayed confined to the wilderness, but the Mongol Empire had recently established a massive, secure trade network spanning from China all the way to the Black Sea. This allowed goods, ideas, and people to move faster than ever before. Therefore, the bacteria caught a ride on the Silk Road. It travelled along the trade routes, hopping from rodent to rodent, moving closer to the heart of Western civilization. By 1346, it reached Kaffa, a wealthy trading port on the Crimean Peninsula owned by Italian merchants. The city was currently surrounded by a besieging Mongol army. As the siege dragged on, the plague tore through the Mongol camp, killing thousands a day. The Mongol commander, facing a crushing defeat, decided on a horrific piece of psychological warfare. He loaded his dead, infected soldiers onto giant catapults and launched them over the city walls. The Italians inside panicked. They threw the bodies into the sea, but the water supply was contaminated. The air smelled of death. Therefore, the surviving merchants scrambled onto their galleys and fled across the Mediterranean. They thought they were escaping. Instead, they were carrying the end of the world in their cargo holds. Once the ships hit European ports, the spread was unstoppable. People didn't understand how it worked. They looked at the symptoms in absolute horror. First, a victim would feel a sudden violent chill. Then, hard, painful swellings called buboes would appear in the groin, armpits, and neck. They could grow to the size of an apple. Next came the internal bleeding. Dark purple spots covered the skin as organs failed. Finally, a terrible stench would emanate from the body as the flesh literally began to rot while the patient was still alive. Death usually arrived within 3 days of the first cough. Because no one knew about germs, they assumed it was a punishment from God, or a misalignment of the planets, or poisonous vapors rising from the earth. Medical science was useless. Doctors wore thick leather robes and bizarre bird masks stuffed with dried flowers to block the smell. They prescribed baths in urine, drinking melted gold, or cutting open the boils and applying a paste made of chopped pigeons and human feces. Therefore, the treatments often killed the patients faster than the disease itself. Society began to fracture under the sheer weight of the mortality rate. In Florence, half the population died in a matter of months. Humanity's basic instincts simply evaporated. Parents abandoned their sick children. Husbands left their wives to die alone in locked rooms. The church, which was supposed to provide spiritual comfort, fell apart. Priests refused to give last rites because they were terrified of infection. Therefore, the Pope had to grant a blanket indulgence, essentially telling everyone that if they died of the plague, their sins were automatically forgiven because there was no one left to confess to. With no one to bury the dead, bodies piled up in the streets like cordwood. In Avignon, the Pope had to consecrate the entire Rhone River so that bodies could be thrown into the water and still technically receive a Christian burial. By 1351, the initial wave began to burn itself out. It simply ran out of people to infect. The immediate aftermath was a landscape of post-apocalyptic silence. Entire villages stood completely empty, the houses intact, but the inhabitants gone. Fields lay fallow. Livestock roamed wild through abandoned towns. Roughly 25 to 30 million people were dead. Europe had lost nearly half its population in less than 4 years. But then, something incredible happened. The survivors didn't just rebuild the old world, they inadvertently created a new one. Before the plague, Europe was trapped in a rigid feudal system. Peasants were essentially slaves, tied to the land, working for wealthy lords for almost nothing because labor was cheap and plentiful. But suddenly half the workers were gone. The lords were desperate, their crops were rotting in the fields, and there was no one to harvest them. Therefore, the remaining peasants realized they held all the cards. They demanded higher wages. They demanded their freedom. If a lord refused, they simply walked away and found a different lord who would pay them more. The feudal system collapsed almost overnight. The standard of living for the average European survivor actually skyrocketed. Meat, which had been a luxury for the rich, became a staple of the peasant diet. Wages doubled and tripled. The massive labor shortage also forced people to become creative. Human muscle was now expensive. Therefore, thinkers and craftsmen had to invent mechanical solutions to do the work of 20 men. This sudden push for efficiency accelerated technological innovation, leading directly to better watermills, advanced metallurgy, and eventually the printing press. Even the medical failure had a silver lining. Because the old texts had failed so completely, European scholars stopped blindly trusting ancient authorities and actually began studying anatomy through dissection. Modern empirical science was born from the ash. The Black Death is usually remembered as history's ultimate tragedy. But the ultimate irony of the plague is that it acted as a violent, horrific reset button. It shattered a stagnant, broken, medieval world and laid the foundation for the Renaissance, the rise of individual liberty, and the modern world we live in today.